Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Christmas not as a season of warmth and candlelight, but as a quiet white silence, so deep that even the world itself seems to have stopped breathing. Because in March of 1888, when the Great Blizzard descended on the eastern United States, winter did not merely interrupt Christmas traditions, it swallowed them whole and forced ordinary people to reinvent what celebration meant when survival came first. The storm arrived without warning, beginning as a gentle snowfall that felt almost familiar, almost comforting, before transforming into a relentless wall of ice and wind that buried cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia under mountains of snow, severed telegraph lines, trapped trains, and turned streets into frozen corridors where horse-drawn carriages vanished and footsteps disappeared within minutes. And although the calendar insisted that Christmas was still months away, the emotional memory of the holiday, the need for warmth, ritual, and human closeness suddenly became urgent again. In homes sealed shut by snowdrifts taller than doors and windows, families gathered not out of festive cheer but necessity, wrapping themselves in layers of woolen quilts as coal stoves burned day and night. And in that dim orange glow the spirit of Christmas quietly resurfaced, not through grand decorations or bustling markets, but through small gestures that felt almost sacred in the cold, such as saving the last piece of fruit, sharing a cup of weak tea, or telling familiar holiday stories simply to distract children from the sound of the wind clawing at the walls. Church bells, which normally marked Christmas with music and procession, were silent during the blizzard, frozen in place or unreachable, and so prayers moved indoors, whispered at kitchen tables where families adapted old Christmas customs into something softer and slower, replacing hymns with murmured gratitude for warmth, for shelter, for the simple miracle of being together while the storm erased the world outside. For many, food meant improvisation rather than feasting, and Christmas traditions of abundance were transformed into lessons of patience and restraint, as housewives stretched flour into simple breads, melted snow for water, and turned preserved meats into thin soups. And yet even these sparse meals were treated with a quiet reverence, eaten slowly, almost ceremonially, because in the heart of the blizzard, the act of sharing a meal itself became the celebration. Children, cut off from schools and streets, experienced a strange kind of Christmas wonder, pressing their faces to frost-covered windows, imagining the snow as something magical rather than dangerous, while parents told stories of past holidays, of warm churches and crowded streets, planting memories that felt like promises that the world would return to normal once the storm finally loosened its grip. And as night fell earlier than usual beneath the heavy clouds, families gathered closer, listening to the storm's steady howl, finding comfort in routine and repetition, unknowingly reshaping what Christmas meant, no longer a date on the calendar, but a feeling of endurance, togetherness, and quiet hope held tightly against the cold. As the blizzard raged on for days that blurred together in a frozen haze, the idea of Christmas drifted further away from ornaments and schedules and settled instead into the rhythm of survival itself, where every morning began with the careful ritual of checking the stove, brushing frost from the inside of windows, and listening for sounds of life beyond the walls. And in that slow routine people found a strange comfort similar to the quiet rituals of the holiday season. In tenement buildings and row houses where neighbors were usually little more than distant silhouettes, doors opened cautiously, and conversations stretched longer than usual, as people shared coal, candles, and rumors about the storm. And in these brief exchanges, the social fabric of Christmas emerged in an unexpected form, not through gifts wrapped in paper, but through borrowed matches, shared blankets, and the unspoken understanding that no one would survive this storm alone. Some families brought out old Christmas decorations months early, not to celebrate the date, but to soften the fear, hanging a single ribbon or lighting a small candle in the evening, simply to remind themselves that warmth and joy still existed somewhere beyond the snow. And these fragile symbols took on a deeper meaning than they ever had in peaceful years, because they represented memory, continuity, and the stubborn refusal to let the storm define the human spirit. Letters meant for Christmas. Greetings never arrived, trains lay frozen on tracks, and newspapers came days late if at all, leaving families suspended in silence. And in that isolation people turned inward, telling stories passed down through generations, stories of earlier winters, earlier hardships, earlier Christmases when survival itself had been the gift. And these stories flowed slowly, like lullabies meant to steady the nerves and quiet the mind. In rural areas where farms were cut off completely, the blizzard transformed Christmas customs into something even more elemental, as families gathered around fireplaces, conserving fuel and light, cooking simple meals from stored grains and salted meats, and marking the passing of each day with prayer and gratitude, treating the storm as a test rather than a catastrophe, believing that endurance was its own form of celebration. As darkness settled in each evening, thicker and heavier than usual, households grew quieter, conversations softened, and the blizzard outside became a constant background hum, almost hypnotic. And in that stillness people rested more, slept longer, and surrendered to a slower pace of life that echoed the deepest, oldest purpose of Christmas itself: to pause, to gather, and to wait together for the return of light. With each passing day the storm seemed to stretch time itself, and Christmas, once imagined as a fixed moment filled with bells and crowded streets, became something fluid and internal, a quiet awareness shared by people who realized that the holiday was no longer something you traveled toward, but something you carried inside while the outside world remained frozen and unreachable. In wealthier homes where coal supplies lasted longer, and servants were stranded indoors alongside their employers, social hierarchies softened slightly under the pressure of necessity, and evenings took on an almost old-world stillness, with families sitting together in lamplight, reading aloud from the Bible or from well-worn novels, recreating the slow, intimate atmosphere of Christmas Eve, not out of tradition, but because silence and storytelling were the safest, warmest ways to pass the hours. In poorer neighborhoods where fuel ran low and rooms grew bitterly cold, Christmas survived through sound rather than sight, as parents hummed carols softly to children wrapped in blankets, not loudly enough to waste breath, but just enough to reassure them that comfort still existed, that the storm had not erased everything familiar, and that morning would come again no matter how deep the snow pressed against the walls. Across cities buried beneath drifts, improvised celebrations emerged in unexpected places, as people marked the days by lighting candles at dusk, setting aside the smallest treat for the evening meal, or pausing before sleep to give thanks for another day endured. And in these modest rituals, Christmas lost its spectacle and revealed its quieter core, the simple act of recognizing warmth, safety, and human presence as gifts. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless work, reshaping streets, collapsing roofs, and erasing landmarks. But inside, homes became small islands of memory, where the idea of Christmas was preserved like a fragile flame, protected by routine, repetition, and the slow breathing of families huddled together in the dark. Even the children, whose excitement usually defined the season, grew calmer during the storm, adapting quickly to the rhythm of confinement, falling asleep to the sound of wind rather than laughter, and waking to another white morning that felt less frightening with each repetition, as if the blizzard itself had become part of the story they would one day tell about a Christmas that came early, silent, and wrapped in snow. As the storm pressed on, exhausting itself slowly but refusing to disappear, Christmas traditions dissolved even further into something almost primal, where the celebration of the season was no longer about marking a holy night or exchanging words of cheer, but about maintaining warmth, calm, and a sense of order while the world outside remained locked in ice. And in that prolonged stillness people discovered that repetition itself could be comforting, much like the repeated rituals of Christmas that returned every year no matter what history threw at them. Mothers kept children busy with small tasks, folding cloth, sorting buttons, or helping stir thin soups, turning necessity into something that resembled festive preparation, while fathers ventured only when absolutely necessary, digging narrow tunnels through snowdrifts or checking on neighbors, returning home with faces burned red by wind and ice, greeted not with celebration but with relief, which in that moment felt far more meaningful than any Christmas greeting. In some homes, battered family Bibles and hymn books were brought out, their pages yellowed and soft, and passages associated with Christmas were read slowly, not as performance but as reassurance, the familiar words acting like anchors that kept fear from drifting too far. And even those who were not deeply religious found themselves clinging to these quiet readings, simply because they brought structure to days that otherwise felt endless and uncertain. The absence of the outside world grew heavier as shops remained closed, deliveries failed, and the usual signals of modern life vanished. And in that isolation, the blizzard pushed people inward, toward memory and imagination, where Christmas scenes from childhood resurfaced vividly, filling cold rooms with invisible warmth, reminding adults that they had once been children listening for footsteps on the stairs or bells in the distance, and that this storm too would eventually pass into memory. As nights deepened and sleep came in long, fragmented stretches, families learned to rest together, breathing in sync beneath shared blankets. The storm outside reduced to a steady, distant roar, and in that collective rest there was a quiet echo of Christmas peace, not joyful or bright, but heavy, protective, and deeply human. The great blizzard did not pause for the holiday, did not soften its winds or lighten its snowfall, but inside those snowbound homes, Christmas endured in its simplest form, stripped of excess and noise, existing only as the determination to care for one another until the world outside finally began to thaw. When the storm finally began to weaken, not with a clear ending but with a gradual loosening of its grip, people did not rush to celebrate because the blizzard had taught them a slower rhythm, and Christmas, once loud and outward-facing, now lingered quietly in the way they moved through their homes, careful not to waste heat, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had kept them safe. In many households, the days after the worst snowfall felt strangely intimate, as if families were reluctant to let go of the closeness forced upon them, lingering longer at the table, speaking more softly, holding on to routines born out of necessity that now felt meaningful. And in that lingering hush, the spirit of Christmas remained present, not as a date or an event, but as a shared memory of endurance. Neighbors emerged cautiously from their homes, greeting one another, not with cheer but with long looks and slow nods, and these first encounters outside felt almost ceremonial, like the quiet walk home after a midnight Christmas service, when words seem unnecessary and presence alone feels sufficient. And even the ruined streets and buried rail lines carried a strange beauty, softened by sunlight reflecting off endless white. For children, the blizzard became a story that would forever redefine Christmas, not as a single morning of gifts, but as a season when families stayed together, when adults slowed down, and when warmth mattered more than anything else. And years later they would remember that Christmas as something heavy and silent and safe, wrapped not in paper but in blankets and memory. The great blizzard of 1888 did not erase Christmas. It compressed it, stripping away noise and excess until only its quiet core remained. And long after the snow melted and the trains ran again, people carried that lesson with them, even if they did not have words for it yet, understanding in some small way that celebration could exist even in stillness, even in fear, even when the world seemed frozen in place. As the snow settled and the city slowly revealed itself again, layer by layer, people discovered that the blizzard had quietly altered their understanding of both winter and Christmas, because the storm had forced them to experience something that modern life usually kept at a distance, a complete pause where time was no longer measured by clocks or schedules but by light, heat, and the simple fact of being awake together. Inside homes, traces of those blizzard days remained visible long after the streets were cleared, in soot-darkened stovepipes, in blankets that smelled faintly of smoke, in tables scarred by constant use, and these marks were not erased quickly, because they carried a memory of closeness, of evenings spent listening rather than speaking, of Christmas traditions reduced to their most essential form, where presence mattered more than performance. Many families spoke quietly about how different this Christmas felt, even months later, describing it not with excitement but with a kind of reverence, recalling how meals were eaten slowly, how every sound inside the house seemed amplified against the muffled silence outside, and how even small comforts, like a warm cup held between cold hands, felt ceremonial, almost sacred, in a way that echoed the deepest meaning of the holiday. Churches, once they reopened, held subdued services where sermons reflected less on joy and more on endurance, gratitude and humility, and congregations listened closely, wrapped in coats, carrying with them the memory of nights spent praying at home rather than beneath stained glass, realizing that faith during the blizzard had been quieter, more private, and perhaps more sincere than any grand Christmas procession. In newspapers that finally resumed regular printing, writers described the storm in dramatic language, but between the lines there were softer stories, brief mentions of families sheltering together, of neighbors saving one another, of children remembering the blizzard as a time when adults were always home, always near, and in those small accounts the hidden Christmas of 1888 quietly revealed itself, not as a celebration interrupted, but as one transformed. For some, the blizzard became a reference point, a dividing line in memory, and future Christmases were compared to it, measured against the year when gifts were secondary, when silence replaced music, and when survival itself felt like the only appropriate form of gratitude. And even as prosperity returned and winters softened, that memory lingered, shaping how people understood hardship, generosity, and the quiet strength found in simply staying together. As spring approached and snow melted into the streets, carrying away the physical traces of the storm, the emotional imprint remained, settling into family stories told softly by fireplaces in later years, retold not to frighten but to calm, to remind listeners that even in the coldest silence, something gentle could survive, something very much like Christmas. As weeks passed and the blizzard receded into memory, Christmas continued to echo through daily life in subtle ways, because people moved more slowly than before, lingering at doorways, checking on one another more often, and carrying forward the quiet habits learned during the storm, habits that had softened them and reminded them how fragile comfort truly was. In many homes, families kept some of the routines born during those snowbound days, gathering each evening by lamplight even when they no longer needed to, sharing stories instead of retreating into separate rooms, because the blizzard had taught them that warmth was not only something produced by coal or firewood, but by voices overlapping gently in the dark, by shared silence that felt safe rather than empty. Older residents especially spoke of the storm in tones usually reserved for sacred events, recalling how Christmas had arrived without decorations, without choirs, without crowded streets, yet somehow felt heavier and more meaningful than any they had known, because it demanded attention, patience, and care, the same qualities that the holiday had always tried to teach but rarely enforced so completely. Children who had lived through the blizzard carried its imprint quietly, growing into adults who remembered a Christmas where the world outside vanished, where parents were always present, where bedtime came early, and mornings began slowly. And those memories resurfaced years later during ordinary winters, softening them, reminding them that stillness could be protective rather than frightening. Even the physical landscape seemed altered in memory, as streets once buried under snow became symbols of endurance, and the image of Christmas lights reflected on ice, real or imagined, lingered in people's minds, blending hardship and beauty into a single story that would be retold whenever winter grew quiet and the air turned sharp. The great blizzard of 1888 did not leave behind monuments or celebrations, but it left something quieter and longer lasting, a shared understanding that Christmas could exist without noise, without abundance, without certainty, surviving instead in the slow rhythm of shared days, in the patience learned while waiting for the storm to pass, and in the calm knowledge that togetherness, once discovered in silence, is not easily forgotten. As the memory of the blizzard aged, it slowly fused with the memory of Christmas itself, until for many families the two could no longer be separated, because whenever winter nights grew unusually quiet or snow fell thick enough to soften the edges of the world, minds returned instinctively to that season, when celebration and catastrophe overlapped and taught them something they had never learned before. In later years, elders would describe that Christmas of the blizzard, not as frightening but as clarifying, explaining how the absence of choice had stripped life down to essentials, where the question was no longer how to celebrate, but how to endure gently, and in that gentleness Christmas revealed its oldest form, not as spectacle but as shelter, as shared breath, as patience stretched across long nights. Homes that once rang with the noise of preparation learned to value quiet again, and even when prosperity returned, some families intentionally dimmed their celebrations, lowering voices, lighting fewer candles, sitting closer together, unconsciously recreating the atmosphere of those snowbound evenings when the outside world had vanished and attention turned inward. The blizzard also reshaped how people spoke about winter to their children, no longer as something to fear or conquer, but as something to respect, something capable of demanding stillness and humility. And Christmas stories began to include not only angels and stars, but storms and silence, teaching that peace was sometimes found not in brightness, but in endurance. When snowstorms later interrupted holidays, trains, or plans, people remembered 1888 and responded differently, with less panic and more patience, knowing that celebration did not disappear just because schedules collapsed, and that Christmas, once learned in silence, could return any time people slowed enough to notice one another. Even decades later, when electric lights replaced oil lamps and cities hummed louder than ever, there remained a quiet cultural memory of that blizzard Christmas, shaping the way people instinctively gathered during hardship, lowered their voices during storms, and understood that warmth was something created together, not purchased or planned. And so the Great Blizzard of 1888 passed from lived experience into shared memory, where it remained not as a disaster alone, but as a strange, frozen Christmas lesson, whispering across generations that sometimes the truest celebration arrives when the world grows still enough to listen. As the years moved forward and the Great Blizzard of 1888 settled deeper into collective memory, Christmas itself began to carry a second, quieter meaning for those who had lived through it, because whenever winter returned with heavy snow and muffled sound, the body remembered before the mind did, slowing instinctively, lowering voices, conserving warmth in the same way it had learned to do during those frozen days when the outside world ceased to exist. In countless households, the memory resurfaced not as fear, but as an atmosphere, a particular stillness that arrived when snow pressed against windows and streets, disappeared beneath white drifts, bringing back the sensation of evenings spent close together, where conversation unfolded slowly, where no one rushed, and where Christmas felt less like an event to perform and more like a condition of being, something that existed simply because people were present with one another. Old habits born during the blizzard lingered in subtle forms, as families continued to value shared meals, eaten without distraction, long evenings by lamplight or firelight, and the simple comfort of knowing everyone was safely inside. And even when future Christmases were filled again with abundance and noise, there remained an undercurrent of restraint, a quiet memory of a year when excess had vanished, and yet the holiday had felt fuller than ever. Those who had been children during the storm grew into adults who instinctively recreated that sense of shelter, choosing to keep Christmas evenings calm, sometimes unknowingly repeating the gestures of their parents, dimming lights, slowing conversations, telling stories rather than seeking entertainment, because something in them remembered that the truest comfort came not from excitement, but from continuity and closeness. In cities rebuilt and modernized, where the blizzard's physical damage faded quickly, its emotional imprint proved far more durable, shaping how people responded to isolation, to interruption, to long winter nights when travel stopped and plans dissolved, because 1888 had taught them that the collapse of routine did not mean the collapse of meaning, and that Christmas could survive even when stripped of all its outward forms. The storm had also quietly altered the relationship between people and winter itself, softening the impulse to resist it and replacing it with a kind of cautious respect. And this shift found its way into Christmas customs, where patience became as important as joy, where waiting was no longer something to endure reluctantly, but something to inhabit fully, as families once again learned to let nights pass slowly, without urgency, without expectation. Stories of the blizzard Christmas were told again and again, often in hushed tones, not as dramatic tales of disaster, but as gentle reminders of a time when the world grew silent and people learned to listen to one another, to their own breathing, to the subtle reassurance that came from shared presence. And these stories settled into the fabric of family history, becoming a kind of seasonal lullaby repeated whenever winter grew heavy. Even the language people used to describe Christmas subtly shifted after 1888, moving away from spectacle and toward feeling, as phrases like warmth, shelter, and togetherness took on deeper resonance, rooted not in metaphor but in lived experience, in memories of cold rooms warmed by shared bodies, of meals stretched thin but eaten with care, of nights when the storm's roar outside made the quiet inside feel precious. And so Christmas, reshaped by the great blizzard, became something quieter but stronger, less dependent on circumstance, more resilient to disruption, existing not because the world cooperated, but because people chose to remain gentle with one another while the world stood still, carrying forward a lesson learned in snow and silence, a lesson that would surface again whenever winter asked them to slow down and remember what truly mattered. As time softened the sharp edges of memory, the Christmas of the Great Blizzard no longer lived only in stories of snow and cold, but in a deeper, quieter awareness that returned each winter like a familiar breath, reminding people that there had once been a season when the world stopped entirely and nothing was expected of them except to endure gently and stay close. In later decades, when Christmas trains ran on time and shops glowed late into the night, those who had lived through 1888 still felt a subtle unease in too much noise or urgency, instinctively longing for the slower rhythm they had known as children or young adults, when days were measured by firelight and darkness rather than clocks, and when Christmas unfolded not as anticipation but as presence. Homes built after the blizzard were often arranged with that memory in mind, with heavier curtains, deeper hearths, thicker walls, and spaces designed for gathering rather than display, as if architecture itself had absorbed the lesson of those frozen days, shaping environments that favored closeness, warmth, and quiet endurance over spectacle. At Christmas dinners years later, pauses in conversation were no longer uncomfortable, because silence had once been a companion during the storm, and in those pauses people felt connected to something older and steadier than celebration, something rooted in shared survival, where words were optional and presence alone was enough. Parents who had survived the blizzard became gentler during winter, more attentive to small discomforts, more patient with delays, more inclined to keep children close rather than rushing them outward into the cold, because the storm had taught them that safety was not guaranteed, but could be cultivated through care, repetition, and calm. Even Christmas gifts, when they returned to abundance, were often chosen with a quiet practicality, shaped by memory, favoring warmth, usefulness, and longevity over novelty, echoing the values learned when scarcity had ruled, and every object had mattered, every candle counted, every scrap of cloth held meaning. During heavy snowfalls in later years, people instinctively recreated the blizzard atmosphere without naming it, drawing curtains early, lighting lamps before dusk, speaking softly, cooking slowly, as if reenacting a ritual passed down through the body rather than the mind. A seasonal response learned during those long days when the outside world disappeared completely. The storm also changed how people understood Christmas faith, not as a moment of revelation or joy alone, but as a practice of patience, humility, and waiting, where hope was not loud or immediate, but steady and enduring, sustained through long nights by nothing more than trust and shared warmth. And so, long after the snow of 1888 had melted into history, Christmas carried within it a memory of stillness, of restraint, of care learned under pressure, shaping generations who may never have seen the blizzard themselves, but who inherited its quiet lesson whenever winter asked them to slow down, gather closer, and let the world remain silent for a while longer. As the decades unfolded, and the great blizzard of 1888 faded from living memory into something almost mythic, Christmas continued to absorb its lessons quietly, becoming less about resisting winter and more about yielding to it, as if the season itself had learned that stillness could be a form of protection rather than loss. In families where the blizzard had once sealed doors shut and pressed snow against windows until daylight disappeared, Christmas evenings retained a particular gravity, a sense that night was not something to be filled or conquered, but something to be entered slowly, with lamps lit early and movement softened, allowing darkness to exist without fear, just as it had during those endless storm-bound nights. The memory of isolation reshaped how people understood togetherness, because after 1888, being together no longer required activity or celebration, only proximity, the quiet assurance that someone else was breathing nearby, that warmth was shared, and that waiting could be done collectively rather than alone. And this understanding settled deeply into the rhythm of Christmas gatherings. Even laughter changed subtly in winter, becoming quieter, less sharp, more contained, as if people instinctively knew that sound once carried differently in snow, absorbed by white silence, and that Christmas joy did not need to announce itself loudly to be real or lasting. Stories told at Christmas grew longer and slower, unfolding without urgency, allowing pauses, repetition, and reflection, mirroring the way time itself had stretched during the blizzard, when days were indistinguishable, and patience became a necessity rather than a virtue. And in these stories, children learned not only history, but how to be still without anxiety. The storm had also left behind a deeper respect for fragility, and Christmas after 1888 carried an awareness that comfort was temporary, warmth was precious, and abundance was never guaranteed, which softened people's expectations and deepened their gratitude, transforming the holiday into a moment of recognition rather than consumption. In quiet neighborhoods blanketed by fresh snow years later, people instinctively limited their movements, not because they had to, but because they remembered, consciously or not, that staying inside had once meant safety, and Christmas became associated with inwardness, with protecting the small world of the home while the larger world rested outside. Those who remembered the blizzard spoke of it not as a tragedy alone, but as a teacher, one that had arrived without invitation and demanded attention, stripping away distractions and leaving behind a distilled version of human connection. And Christmas, woven into that memory, became the season when those lessons resurfaced most clearly. As modern life grew louder and faster, the memory of that silent Christmas remained like a counterweight, pulling people gently back toward simplicity each winter, reminding them that the holiday had once survived without electricity, without travel, without certainty, sustained only by patience, care, and the willingness to wait together. And so Christmas, shaped quietly by the great blizzard of 1888, continued to exist not just as a celebration, but as a practiced calm, a seasonal permission to slow down, to gather close, and to let the world pause without trying to fix it, carrying forward a memory of snow, silence, and shared endurance that never truly melted away. As memory continued to thin with each generation, the great blizzard of 1888 no longer lived as a specific event for most people, but as a quiet inheritance passed down through behavior rather than words, shaping how Christmas was felt rather than explained, sensed rather than remembered, returning each winter as an instinct to slow down when snow deepened and the world grew hushed. By the early 20th century, many no longer knew the names of the streets buried under drifts or the trains frozen in place, Yet the emotional residue of that blizzard Christmas remained embedded in custom, in the way families instinctively gathered earlier in the evening during winter, in the way curtains were drawn against the dark, in the way voices softened once snow began to fall. As if the weather itself demanded a gentler tone, Christmas dinners, even when plentiful, often carried an undercurrent of restraint, a collective awareness that abundance was something to be respected rather than assumed, and plates were filled with care rather than excess. Conversations unfolded slowly, and gratitude lingered longer than excitement, echoing the blizzard days when every resource had been counted, and every shared moment felt necessary. In towns that had once been paralyzed by the storm, older buildings creaked quietly in winter winds, their thick walls and narrow rooms a physical reminder of an era when staying inside had been an act of survival, and Christmas within those walls felt naturally intimate, encouraging closeness, patience, and long stretches of quiet that modern life rarely allowed elsewhere. The blizzard had also altered how people understood waiting, transforming it from an inconvenience into a shared experience, and Christmas became the season when waiting was once again permitted, even encouraged, whether waiting for dawn, for warmth, for others to arrive, or simply for the night to pass, mirroring those storm-bound days when there was nothing to do but remain still and trust that the world would eventually move again. Children born long after 1888 absorbed these rhythms without knowing their origin, learning that winter evenings were meant for stories, for rest, for stillness, rather than constant motion, and Christmas became the time when that lesson was most gently reinforced, not through instruction, but through atmosphere, through the quiet consensus that there was nowhere else to be. Even technology, as it entered homes, was often muted during winter holidays, lights dimmed, sounds lowered, as if the memory of the blizzard resisted intrusion, preserving a space where silence still held value, where Christmas could exist without interruption, just as it had during those long nights when the storm had cut every connection to the outside world. The great blizzard had taught people that isolation did not have to mean loneliness, and this lesson quietly reshaped Christmas gatherings, making them less performative and more protective, centered not on display or productivity, but on the simple assurance that no one would face the cold alone. Over time, Christmas itself became a vessel for that lesson, carrying forward the understanding that warmth was not merely physical, but communal, created through shared stillness, shared patience, and shared presence, qualities that had once been essential for survival, and now lingered as tradition. And so, without monuments or anniversaries, the blizzard lived on each winter, resurfacing softly in the way people responded to snow, to silence, to darkness, and to one another, ensuring that Christmas, long after the storm had passed, remained a season not only of celebration, but of quiet endurance learned in a world that had once been buried in white. As winter after winter passed, the Christmas shaped by the great blizzard of 1888 became less a remembered moment and more a seasonal instinct, something that settled into the bones of communities along the eastern seaboard, guiding how people moved, spoke, and gathered whenever snow thickened and the world softened into silence. Long before calendars or advertisements announced the holiday, the body already knew when Christmas was near, because colder nights encouraged earlier rest, meals slowed and evenings stretched gently, echoing those storm-bound days when time had loosened its grip, and nothing outside the home demanded attention or urgency. In families that traced their roots back to that era, there remained a subtle reverence for winter nights, especially around Christmas, when doors were closed not in isolation but in protection, and the interior of the home became its own small universe, defined by warmth, routine, and the quiet reassurance of shared presence, just as it had been when snow once erased the streets beyond the windows. The blizzard had quietly redefined what it meant to feel safe, teaching people that safety was not guaranteed by walls alone, but by cooperation, attentiveness, and the willingness to remain close when the outside world became hostile. And Christmas absorbed this lesson fully, becoming the season when closeness was not optional, but essential. Even gestures of care grew slower and more deliberate, with hands lingering longer on shoulders, voices dropping instinctively in volume, and movements becoming careful and economical, as if every action carried the memory of conserving heat, conserving energy, conserving one another. Habits learned during the storm and passed down unconsciously through generations. In later years, when snowstorms disrupted travel or cut power, panic rarely took hold in the same way, because communities remembered, at least in spirit, that stillness could be endured, that waiting together was safer than rushing alone, and Christmas became the emotional framework through which these disruptions were understood and softened. Stories told during the holiday often circled back to themes of shelter, patience, and endurance, even when the blizzard itself was no longer named, because the storm had embedded its values into the narrative of winter, shaping what people believed Christmas was truly for, not display or excess, but care under pressure. As modern life accelerated outside the holiday season, Christmas remained an island of slowness, protected by tradition and memory, where the lessons of 1888 resurfaced quietly, reminding people that progress could pause, that productivity could rest, and that survival once depended not on speed, but on stillness and trust. The Great Blizzard, long gone from headlines and history books for most, continued to live on through these winter rituals, ensuring that Christmas retained a deeper gravity, a sense of humility before nature, and a respect for silence that no amount of modern noise could entirely erase. And so, year after year, as snow fell and the world softened again, Christmas continued to carry the quiet echo of that frozen season, inviting people, even without knowing why, to slow their breathing, draw closer together, and let the outside world remain silent just a little while longer. As the memory of the Great Blizzard dissolved almost completely from spoken history, its influence remained woven into the emotional architecture of Christmas itself, shaping not what people remembered, but how they felt when winter tightened its grip, and the world outside grew distant and unreachable. In countless homes, Christmas evenings unfolded with an unspoken understanding that nothing needed to happen, that the value of the night lay not in activity but in duration, in allowing time to stretch and soften, just as it had during the blizzard when hours passed without markers and patience became the only reliable structure left. People learned, without ever being taught, that winter was not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to be accommodated, and Christmas became the season when this accommodation felt natural, even welcome, as if the holiday itself granted permission to withdraw gently from the world and exist fully within a smaller, warmer circle. The blizzard had taught earlier generations that plans were fragile and could vanish overnight, and this understanding lingered in Christmas traditions that emphasized readiness rather than perfection, meals prepared simply, homes arranged for comfort rather than display, gatherings focused on presence rather than punctuality, reflecting the old lesson that survival favored flexibility and calm. Silence, once forced by the storm, became a chosen companion during the holiday, filling rooms without discomfort, allowing thoughts to drift slowly, memories to surface naturally, and conversations to unfold without urgency, creating an atmosphere where Christmas felt less like a performance and more like a shared breath taken together. In moments when snow fell heavily and muffled the world, people instinctively lowered their voices, dimmed their lights, and moved with care, reenacting behaviors once born of necessity, now preserved as instinct, as if the body itself remembered the blizzard even when the mind did not. Christmas faith, too, absorbed this memory, shifting subtly away from expectation toward endurance, away from revelation toward trust, emphasizing the quiet strength required to wait through darkness without certainty, mirroring the long nights of 1888, when hope existed not as promise, but as persistence. Even joy during Christmas became softer, deeper, less explosive, rooted in relief rather than excitement, in the knowledge that warmth had been secured, that company was present, that the night could be endured safely, echoing the emotional relief felt each evening during the storm when doors were closed and fires still burned. As cities grew louder and brighter with each passing decade, Christmas remained a rare pocket of stillness, preserved by habits whose origins were forgotten but whose purpose endured, offering a pause from motion, a return to something slower and more human, shaped long ago by a blizzard that had demanded silence and rewarded togetherness. And so, the great blizzard of 1888 continued to exist quietly inside Christmas itself, not as a remembered disaster, but as a lingering calm, a seasonal reminder that when the world withdraws, people can draw closer, that celebration can survive without spectacle, and that sometimes the truest meaning of Christmas is learned when nothing moves at all. As Christmas continued to be carried forward by habit rather than memory, the blizzard's influence settled into the smallest details of winter life, shaping not what people said about the season but how they inhabited it, teaching them to accept slowness as natural and stillness as protective. Whenever snow erased the edges of the world, during heavy winters, streets growing quiet earlier than expected felt less like abandonment and more like a return to something familiar, as if the city itself remembered how to rest, and Christmas evenings unfolded without pressure, allowing households to exist in a gentle suspension where time no longer demanded progress or productivity. The lessons of the blizzard lived on in posture and gesture, in the way coats were hung carefully to dry, in the way hands lingered near sources of warmth, in the way people instinctively checked on one another before nightfall, behaviors learned when isolation had once been dangerous, and presence had meant safety. Christmas conversations reflected this inheritance, drifting toward reflection rather than excitement, toward shared recollection rather than anticipation, as if winter encouraged people to look inward, to value continuity over novelty, and to find reassurance in repetition, echoing the endless days of the storm, when sameness had been comforting rather than dull. Food during the holiday carried a quiet symbolism shaped by scarcity remembered in the body, favoring warmth, nourishment, and longevity. Dishes meant to sustain rather than impress, eaten slowly and deliberately, because the act of sharing a meal had once been inseparable from survival, and Christmas preserved that gravity even in times of abundance. The blizzard had also softened people's relationship with darkness, teaching them that night did not always need to be conquered with light, and Christmas evenings often embraced shadow, allowing rooms to glow dimly, conversations to settle into murmurs, and rest to arrive naturally, mirroring the long nights when the storm ruled and quiet had been a form of peace. Children raised within this atmosphere learned to associate Christmas not only with joy but with calm, with protection, with the sense that nothing urgent was required of them, absorbing a seasonal rhythm that valued being over doing, a rhythm first imposed by the blizzard and later preserved by choice. Even solitude during the holidays carried a different meaning, no longer equated with absence but understood as a shared condition, a collective withdrawal from the outer world that made space for connection within, reflecting the storm's lesson that separation from the outside did not have to mean separation from one another. As generations passed, Christmas remained one of the few times when society allowed itself to slow openly, when delays were forgiven, when silence was acceptable, and when waiting together felt purposeful, carrying forward a memory older than anyone present, shaped by a winter when movement had been impossible and patience had saved lives. And so, year after year, without conscious intention, people continued to reenact the quiet choreography learned during the Great Blizzard of 1888, letting Christmas become a season not of interruption, but of suspension, where the world could pause, breath could deepen, and human closeness could once again become the center of everything. As the quiet inheritance of the Great Blizzard continued to pass from one winter to the next, Christmas became a season less defined by anticipation and more by acceptance, a time when people no longer fought the shortening days or the closing of roads, but adjusted gently, allowing life to contract inward without anxiety or resistance. In homes across snowbound regions, there existed an unspoken agreement that winter evenings belonged to no one else, that obligations could wait, that urgency could dissolve, and Christmas offered a socially sanctioned stillness where the lessons of the storm resurfaced naturally, reminding people that rest was not failure, but wisdom learned long ago. The memory of being cut off from the world shaped how people treated interruption, and when weather disrupted plans, cancelled journeys, or silenced communication, frustration softened into patience, because somewhere beneath conscious thought lingered the understanding that connection could survive without movement. That closeness did not depend on distance travelled, but on attention shared. Christmas rooms were arranged instinctively for containment rather than display. Chairs drawn closer, tables cleared for warmth rather than ornament, lighting softened to reduce glare against the dark, all subtle echoes of those blizzard nights, when comfort had been carefully constructed within small, protected spaces. The holidays' music, too, slowed over time, favouring gentler rhythms and familiar melodies repeated year after year, songs that did not demand excitement but offered reassurance, functioning less as celebration and more as a steady presence, much like the wind outside during the storm, constant, enveloping, impossible to ignore, yet strangely calming. Winter conversations grew reflective, less driven by news or novelty, more focused on continuity, on shared history, on simple observations about weather, warmth, and time passing. Because these had once been the most important topics during the blizzard, the things that mattered when everything else fell away. Christmas faith absorbed this tone, leaning into humility and waiting rather than triumph, emphasizing the strength found in patience, in remaining steady through uncertainty, mirroring the spiritual endurance practiced quietly in homes when churches were inaccessible, and prayer became something personal, whispered, sustained through long nights. Even the concept of hope changed subtly, shifting away from expectation of immediate change and toward trust in gradual return, the belief that light would come back not suddenly, but slowly, as it had after the storm, when snow melted bit by bit, and life resumed without announcement. The Great Blizzard taught people that survival often looked uneventful, that it happened in small, repetitive acts carried out calmly day after day, and Christmas preserved this understanding, honoring the quiet labor of care, the patience of waiting, the discipline of staying warm together while nothing outside moved. And so, each winter, when snow fell heavily and the world retreated, Christmas continued to echo the ancient lesson learned in 1888, inviting people to slow their bodies, lower their voices, draw closer, and trust that stillness itself could carry them safely through the longest nights, just as it once had, long ago, when the storm had covered everything in white silence. As winter settled in year after year, Christmas increasingly became the moment when society collectively allowed itself to remember something it could not fully name, a memory carried not in facts or dates, but in posture, tone, and rhythm, as if the body itself recognized that this season once demanded stillness for survival, and now asked for it again, gently, without force. In towns and cities that had once been paralyzed by the blizzard, Christmas mornings often began quietly, without urgency, with streets empty longer than usual and homes slow to wake, echoing those storm-bound days when there had been nowhere to go and nothing to rush toward, only the careful unfolding of another day spent indoors together. People lingered over simple tasks, boiling water, warming bread, checking the fire, actions that felt grounding rather than mundane, because they mirrored the routines that had once kept families alive, and Christmas absorbed these gestures into tradition, transforming necessity into comfort, repetition into reassurance. The idea of progress softened during the holiday, because winter itself had once made progress impossible, and Christmas became the annual reminder that life could pause without collapsing, that stillness was not stagnation but a different kind of movement, one that happened inwardly rather than outwardly. Older generations, even when they could no longer recall the blizzard clearly, retained a reverence for winter silence, instinctively protecting it during Christmas, turning down radios, speaking more softly, allowing gaps in conversation to exist without explanation, as if honoring a quiet that had once been imposed and now was freely chosen. Children growing up in this atmosphere learned that Christmas was not only about excitement or abundance, but about safety, about the feeling that nothing bad would happen while everyone was gathered inside, absorbing a sense of trust that traced back to nights when the storm outside had made closeness essential. Snow itself became symbolic, no longer merely decorative, but carrying an emotional weight shaped by history, because heavy snowfall once meant isolation and danger, and Christmas taught people to respond, not with fear, but with calm preparation, acceptance, and mutual care. Even solitude during the holiday felt different, framed not as absence but as shared withdrawal, a collective turning inward that connected people across homes and neighborhoods, knowing that others were also inside, also waiting, also moving slowly through the same long winter hours. The blizzard had quietly rewritten the emotional contract between people and winter, and Christmas became the season when that contract was renewed, when society agreed implicitly to slow down together, to lower expectations, to prioritize warmth and presence over achievement or display. And so, without ceremony or acknowledgement, the Great Blizzard of 1888 continued to shape Christmas long after its snow had melted, living on in habits that favored gentleness over urgency, patience over excitement, and togetherness over motion, ensuring that each winter, when the world grew quieter, people would remember how to wait safely, calmly, and together. As the winter nights deepened and Christmas continued to return each year, the quiet discipline learned during the Great Blizzard remained embedded in the way people endured darkness, because the storm had taught them that night was not something to be feared or filled, but something to be lived through patiently, one slow hour at a time together. In many households, Christmas evenings were marked not by activity, but by presence, by the simple fact that everyone was inside, accounted for, warm enough, and this alone felt sufficient, echoing the blizzard nights when the question was never what to do next, but whether everyone had what they needed to make it through until morning. The absence of urgency became a defining feature of the holiday, because winter itself once demanded that urgency be abandoned, and Christmas preserved that demand gently, offering a pause from the constant forward motion of the rest of the year, allowing people to rest without guilt, to sit without explanation, to exist without producing anything at all. Furniture was drawn closer, bodies leaned inward, and rooms shrank emotionally into smaller, safer spaces, mirroring the way families had once gathered around stoves and fireplaces during the storm, concentrating warmth, light, and attention where it mattered most, turning confinement into comfort through closeness. The soundscape of Christmas softened as well, with fewer sharp noises, fewer interruptions, more steady, low tones, as if the memory of wind howling outside frozen walls still guided how much sound felt appropriate, encouraging calm voices and measured movements that conserved not just heat, but emotional energy. Time itself felt altered during the holiday, stretching and slowing in a way that felt natural rather than imposed, reflecting the blizzard days when clocks lost relevance and daylight, warmth, and rest became the only meaningful markers of passing hours. Even anticipation changed shape, no longer racing toward a single moment, but spreading evenly across days and nights, allowing Christmas to exist as a continuous state rather than a peak, much like the storm that had no clear beginning or end, only a gradual arrival and a slow release. People learned to tolerate uncertainty during winter, carrying forward the blizzard's lesson that not everything could be predicted or controlled, and Christmas became the season when uncertainty was accepted most easily, softened by routine, familiarity, and the reassurance of shared space. This inheritance shaped how communities responded to hardship, long after the blizzard itself was forgotten, because Christmas had taught them, year after year, that survival often looked quiet, unremarkable, and repetitive, sustained by care rather than heroism, patience rather than action. And so the influence of that frozen season continued to ripple outward, shaping not only how Christmas was celebrated, but how winter itself was endured, teaching generations to slow their bodies, soften their voices, draw closer together, and trust that waiting, when done collectively and gently, could carry them safely through even the longest, darkest nights. As the years folded one into another, Christmas increasingly became the moment when people allowed themselves to live as they once had during the blizzard, even if they no longer knew why, instinctively retreating from the outer world and settling into an interior rhythm where safety mattered more than speed and closeness mattered more than novelty. Winter afternoons shortened into dusks that arrived early and stayed long, and instead of resisting this loss of light, households accepted it quietly, lighting lamps before sunset, closing curtains without ceremony, and letting the night exist as it was, echoing the blizzard days when darkness had been unavoidable, and learning to coexist with it had been essential. The memory of being snowbound transformed how people understood comfort, shifting it away from excess and toward reliability, toward the reassurance of familiar spaces and repeated routines, and Christmas absorbed this lesson fully, becoming the season when repetition felt grounding rather than dull, when doing the same things each evening felt like protection rather than habit. People learned to listen differently during winter, paying attention to subtle sounds inside the home, the crackle of fire, the movement of others, the quiet settling of the building itself, because once during the storm these sounds had been the only signs that life continued, and Christmas preserved this attentiveness, encouraging presence over distraction. Even when storms did not arrive, Christmas carried their absence gently, creating a space where nothing dramatic needed to happen, where calm itself was enough, reflecting the blizzard's lesson that survival did not always announce itself, but often unfolded quietly, moment by moment, in ordinary acts of care. Generations who had never seen the snowdrifts of 1888 still inherited its emotional logic, understanding without explanation that winter asked something different of them, that Christmas was not meant to conquer the season, but to move within it carefully, respecting its limits and adapting to its pace. The blizzard had taught people that warmth was something to be managed thoughtfully, and this awareness lingered in Christmas practices that emphasized gathering in smaller spaces, sharing resources, and remaining mindful of one another's comfort, turning practical care into seasonal ritual. As modern conveniences multiplied, the quiet customs persisted, not out of nostalgia, but because they worked, because they created a sense of safety and cohesion that technology alone could not replace. And Christmas remained the time when these customs resurfaced most clearly, reminding people how to exist together without urgency. Over time, the holiday became less about marking a moment, and more about inhabiting a state of being, a prolonged pause in which the outside world receded, and the interior world grew richer, shaped by lessons learned during a winter when movement had been impossible and patience had been life-saving. And so Christmas continued, year after year, carrying within it the unspoken memory of the great blizzard of 1888, guiding people gently toward stillness, teaching them to accept darkness without fear, to wait without anxiety, and to trust that shared quiet could be enough to carry them through whatever winter placed outside their doors. As winter returned again and again, Christmas slowly became the only time of year when people collectively allowed themselves to live at the pace the blizzard had once forced upon them, a pace where nothing needed to be optimized, accelerated, or improved, where simply remaining warm, present, and attentive to one another was enough to justify the passing of the hours. In many homes, this rhythm revealed itself most clearly in the evenings, when lights were kept low, not for atmosphere but for comfort, when voices softened naturally as darkness thickened outside, and when the boundaries of the house seemed to contract, turning rooms into shared shelters rather than separate spaces, echoing the way families had once gathered tightly around a single source of heat during the storm. The memory of isolation reshaped how people understood togetherness, because closeness during the blizzard had not been chosen for pleasure, but for survival, and Christmas preserved that closeness in gentler form, encouraging people to sit nearer, linger longer, and remain present even when conversation drifted into silence. Time during the holiday felt strangely generous, stretching without pressure, allowing moments to unfold slowly, mirroring the storm days when time had lost its sharp edges and no one knew how long the waiting would last, only that it had to be endured calmly and together. Food, even when abundant, carried a quiet seriousness shaped by that memory, prepared with care, eaten slowly, and shared deliberately, because once meals had been thin and precious, and Christmas retained the understanding that nourishment was not something to rush or waste, but something to honor. The blizzard had also taught people how fragile connection could be, how easily roads, wires, and schedules could disappear, and Christmas became the season when connection was reinforced through presence rather than infrastructure, through shared space rather than communication, through physical nearness rather than plans. Winter weather, once an inconvenience, took on a moral weight, reminding people of limits they could not negotiate, and Christmas absorbed this humility, encouraging acceptance over control, patience over frustration, and care over ambition, shaping a holiday that worked with the season rather than against it. Children raised in this atmosphere learned that Christmas was safe rather than exciting, dependable rather than dazzling, a time when the world slowed enough for adults to be fully present, when nothing unexpected was demanded of them, and this sense of safety traced its roots back to nights when the storm outside had made protection the highest priority. Even solitude during Christmas felt held rather than empty, because isolation during the blizzard had been collective, shared across neighborhoods and cities, and the holiday preserved this feeling, allowing people to be alone without feeling abandoned, knowing others were also inside, also waiting, also moving slowly through the same winter darkness. And so the quiet logic of the Great Blizzard continued to live on inside Christmas, shaping the way people inhabited winter without ever naming its source, guiding them gently towards stillness, restraint, and closeness, ensuring that each year, when the nights grew longest and the world withdrew, they would remember, instinctively, how to endure together. As the seasons kept turning and the memory of the Great Blizzard sank further into the past, Christmas increasingly became a quiet rehearsal of endurance, a time when people practiced living with less motion, less certainty, and fewer demands without ever naming the origin of that instinct, only feeling that winter asked for something gentler than the rest of the year. During long Christmas nights, when snow muted the streets and the air felt heavy with stillness, people instinctively conserved not just heat, but energy, allowing thoughts to slow, letting conversations drift without direction, resting in the knowledge that nothing outside required immediate attention, just as it once had not during the storm when survival depended on patience rather than action. Homes felt smaller in winter, not physically, but emotionally, drawing attention inward, encouraging closeness and care, and Christmas embraced this contraction, turning it into comfort, making narrow spaces feel protective rather than confining, echoing the blizzard days when safety was found in proximity rather than space. The storm had taught people that uncertainty could last longer than expected, and Christmas became the season where uncertainty was tolerated most easily, where waiting was not framed as failure or delay, but as a natural state, softened by routine, warmth, and shared presence, allowing days to pass without urgency. In communities shaped by that inherited memory, help arrived quietly during winter, without announcement or ceremony, neighbors checking in, sharing warmth, offering presents rather than solutions, reflecting the storm's lesson that survival was collective and often unremarkable, carried out through small, repeated acts of care. The absence of spectacle became a defining feature of Christmas calm, because the blizzard had stripped away all performance, leaving only what mattered, and the holiday preserved that simplicity, valuing consistency over novelty, depth over display, and steadiness over excitement. Even when the outside world remained accessible, Christmas encouraged a voluntary withdrawal, an agreement to step back from constant movement and connection, creating a shared pause that mirrored the forced isolation of 1888, but transformed into a chosen stillness that felt restorative rather than threatening. Winter light, scarce and precious, was treated with care during the holiday. Lamps placed deliberately, candles used sparingly, darkness allowed to exist without being chased away, honoring the memory of nights when light had been limited, and learning to live within those limits had been essential. The blizzard had also reshaped how people understood resilience, revealing it not as dramatic strength, but as quiet persistence. And Christmas carried this understanding forward, celebrating not triumph, but continuity, the simple fact of making it through another long night together. And so, year after year, Christmas continued to echo the slow heartbeat of that frozen season, guiding people gently into stillness, reminding them that when the world retreats, there is no need to rush after it, that warmth can be preserved, time can be endured, and life can continue quietly, patiently, one calm winter night at a time. As winter settled deeper into the calendar, Christmas increasingly functioned as a kind of collective breathing space, a season when people instinctively reduced their pace and expectations, mirroring the restraint once demanded by the Great Blizzard, when every movement had been measured and every decision guided by the simple need to endure without waste or panic. The storm had taught earlier generations that comfort was fragile, and this awareness lingered in Christmas habits that favored preparedness over excess, steady warmth over spectacle, and reliability over surprise, shaping a holiday where reassurance mattered more than novelty, and repetition became a source of calm rather than monotony. Inside homes, evenings unfolded with a softness that felt deliberate yet unforced, lights kept low, sounds subdued, bodies settling naturally into stillness, as if the memory of snow pressing against doors and windows still guided how much energy was allowed to escape into the night. Conversations during the holiday often slowed into reflection, circling familiar themes, returning to shared memories, lingering in pauses that felt full rather than empty, because silence had once been the background against which survival unfolded, and Christmas preserved that silence as a companion rather than an absence. The blizzard had also reshaped people's tolerance for waiting, teaching them that resolution did not arrive quickly or on command, and Christmas became the season where waiting was not resisted, but accepted, softened by warmth, routine, and the reassurance that others were waiting too. Even movement through winter space carried this inheritance. Footsteps measured on snow, travel approached cautiously, plans held lightly, reflecting an understanding that nature set limits that could not be negotiated, only respected. And Christmas absorbed this humility fully, encouraging cooperation with the season rather than defiance. Children raised within this rhythm learned to associate Christmas with safety and steadiness, with the sense that adults were not rushing away, that the world had slowed enough to be held, and this feeling traced back to nights when families had stayed close, because the storm made distance dangerous. The holiday's emotional center shifted subtly toward preservation rather than expansion, toward holding what existed rather than reaching outward, echoing the blizzard's lesson that survival depended on maintaining what you had rather than seeking more. As modern life continued to accelerate beyond the winter months, Christmas remained a protected interval, carrying forward the quiet discipline learned in 1888, reminding people that not all progress was forward motion, that sometimes endurance meant standing still together while the world waited. And so the great blizzard, long gone in snow and name, continued to live on through Christmas itself, shaping a season of restraint, patience, and shared stillness, where warmth was guarded, time was allowed to stretch, and human closeness once again became the most important thing in the room. As the longest nights of the year settled in, Christmas continued to act as a quiet agreement between people and winter, an understanding that this was not the season for urgency or conquest, but for endurance shaped by care, a lesson first learned when the great blizzard had removed every illusion of control and left only patience in its place. During these nights, the boundary between one day and the next softened, hours blending together as they once had during the storm, and Christmas allowed this softening to exist without anxiety, permitting people to sleep longer, wake slower, and exist without the pressure to mark time precisely, trusting that morning would come when it was ready. The blizzard had taught people that energy was precious, and this awareness lingered in the way Christmas was lived, with fewer demands placed on the body and mind, fewer expectations of productivity, fewer reasons to rush, creating a seasonal permission to conserve strength and attention, just as families once had to conserve heat and light. Homes became emotional shelters, as much as physical ones, spaces where the outside world receded willingly, where news lost urgency, where the future could wait, and Christmas preserved this retreat, turning withdrawal into comfort rather than isolation, a shared inward turn that felt safe and deliberate. The sound of winter itself, wind moving softly around buildings, snow settling, distant silence, was no longer unsettling, because it echoed nights when such sounds had been constant companions, and Christmas embraced these sounds, allowing them to exist without interruption, reinforcing the sense that nothing needed to be fixed or changed. People learned to trust stillness during the holiday, to believe that absence of movement did not mean absence of life, that care could unfold quietly, and that presence did not require activity, lessons once learned when survival depended on remaining calm while the storm raged unseen beyond sealed doors. Even memory behaved differently during Christmas, drifting without direction, resurfacing old images, voices, and sensations slowly, mirroring the way the blizzard had stretched perception, making each moment feel suspended, and the holiday welcomed this drifting, allowing thought to wander without purpose. The Great Blizzard had shown that catastrophe did not always announce itself loudly, and Christmas carried this awareness gently, fostering attentiveness rather than fear, encouraging people to notice small comforts, shared warmth, steady breathing, because these were the things that had once mattered most. As generations passed, fewer could name the storm or place it in history, yet its logic remained intact, guiding how people responded to winter, to darkness, to waiting, and Christmas became the vessel through which this logic was renewed each year. And so the season continued, not rushing toward resolution but lingering in its own quiet rhythm, shaped by a winter long ago when the world had stopped moving, and people learned, slowly and together, how to endure the silence. As the nights pressed closer together, and daylight thinned into something pale and brief, Christmas continued to function as a kind of inherited calm, a season where people instinctively accepted limits rather than challenging them, because somewhere deep in collective memory remained the knowledge that there had once been a winter when limits were absolute and survival depended on respecting them. During these weeks, the outside world felt distant even when it remained accessible, and Christmas allowed that distance to exist without guilt, granting permission to turn inward, to stay close to familiar walls, familiar faces, familiar routines, echoing the blizzard days when venturing out was not brave but reckless, and staying in was an act of care. The storm had taught people to value predictability over excitement, and this preference quietly shaped the holiday, encouraging rituals that repeated themselves year after year without change. Meals prepared the same way, stories told in the same order, evenings unfolding with reassuring familiarity, because repetition had once been the safest structure available when everything else was uncertain. Even emotions during Christmas became steadier, less volatile, guided by an understanding that extremes were exhausting and unsustainable in winter, and that gentleness conserved energy, a lesson learned when fear had to be managed carefully during the storm, so it would not waste warmth or strength. The blizzard had also revealed how thin the barrier was between comfort and exposure, and Christmas carried this awareness gently, fostering gratitude that was quiet rather than celebratory, rooted not in abundance but in continuity, in the simple fact that shelter held, warmth endured, and people remained together. Homes during the holiday felt almost timeless, insulated not only from cold but from urgency, as if clocks slowed and schedules loosened their grip, mirroring the storm days when time had ceased to function normally, and patience became the only reliable measure. Children absorbed this rhythm naturally, learning that Christmas was not something that rushed toward them, but something that surrounded them slowly, a season that unfolded at the same pace as winter itself, teaching them early how to wait without anxiety and how to find safety in stillness. The memory of isolation reshaped how people understood connection, emphasizing physical presence over communication, shared space over exchange, and Christmas preserved this understanding, reminding people that closeness did not require movement or novelty, only attention and care. Even when storms did not arrive, Christmas carried the emotional imprint of storms past, shaping how people responded to silence, darkness, and waiting, transforming these conditions from threats into companions, from obstacles into context within which life continued gently. And so the quiet discipline learned during the Great Blizzard remained alive within Christmas, guiding each generation toward a slower pace, a softer tone, and a deeper tolerance for stillness, ensuring that when winter pressed hardest, people would know how to endure together, calmly, without needing the world to move again just yet. And then, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, winter finally loosened its grip, the way it always does, not with ceremony or announcement, but through small signs that could only be recognized by those who had learned how to wait. A softer light in the morning, a drip of water from melting snow, a silence that felt less heavy than before. The Great Blizzard of 1888 passed into history, as storms always do, its snow melting into streets and rivers, its dangers reduced to dates and measurements. But what it left behind could not be cleared away so easily, because it had reshaped the way people understood winter, patience, and Christmas itself, teaching them that celebration did not require movement, abundance, or certainty, only care, closeness, and time. Long after the streets were cleared and the trains ran again, Christmas continued to carry that lesson quietly, reminding each generation, even if they could no longer name its source, that warmth is something created together, that stillness can be protective, and that waiting, when shared, is not emptiness but trust. And so, every year, when winter returns and the world grows quieter, Christmas arrives not as an interruption to the cold, but as a companion to it, a gentle invitation to slow down, draw closer, and remember, instinctively, how people once endured a season when nothing moved, and how, in that silence, they discovered that simply being together was enough.